Hello, it's Miss Coletta here, and today I would like to look at how to make a histogram. Now, a histogram is just another plot that we can use to display a data set. In the past, we've used stem and leaf plots or number line plots, and today we'll add histograms. So just to review, if you've learned about histograms before, a histogram always has an x and y axis, and on the x-axis we always have whatever the data values are in our data set, and that label will change depending on whatever our data set deals with. On the y-axis, we always have frequency, always and forever, and that will not change. Frequency just tells us how often something occurs, and we need to know that when we make a histogram, so that's always our y-axis. And then, of course, anytime you make any kind of graph or plot, you need a title. So if you remember, histograms deal with bars, and the bars represent how often the data occurs. It shows us the frequency of each data value. So I've already set myself up with my axes down here, and we're ready to get started. So on this set of axes, I have to decide what to label the x-axis, and I look over here and notice that my data set deals with the number of children in the household, so that seems like a good label for me. So here I'll write number of children. In the household. And then on my y-axis, I always put frequency. And I need a title. And in this particular case, I'll just put family number of children. And then I'm ready to get started. Now, one of the most important things we have to do when we make a histogram is we have to pick a scale for each of our axes. And the hardest scale to pick, or I guess the most important scale to pick, is the x-axis. When you're looking at the x-axis, you have to take a look at your data set and see pretty much how big your numbers are and what you need to be able to see on your x-axis to show all of the numbers. So looking at this data set, it looks like all of my numbers are pretty small. They're between 1 and 6. So if my data set is that small, I usually use a scale of just 1 so that I can see every single value. So I'm going to give myself some tick marks. Try to space them out evenly. And then if and only if I'm using a scale of 1 for a histogram, then I actually put the numbers in between the tick marks, right here. So instead of putting it on the tick mark like you usually would for a graph, I'm going to put it here. And I'll show you why as I start to build my histogram. Notice I can see all my data values 1 to 6. Now the frequency axis is a little easier. We don't really have any decisions to make here except for how high to make the frequency axis. I always make it count by 1. And then remember, frequency tells you how much something occurs, so I just look again at my data set and I try to get a feel for how often the most popular number repeats. And as I look here, it looks like 2 is a very popular number in this table. Maybe not the most frequent, but probably a good one to look at. And it occurs 6 times. So in order to make sure I can cover all of my points, maybe I'll make my frequency axis go up to about 8 or so. Again, trying to space my tick marks as evenly as possible. It's always a good idea when you're making a histogram to leave a little extra room on whatever paper you're making it above in case you need to extend that frequency axis if you realize it's not tall enough. And notice here as I label my numbers on the frequency axis that I actually do put them right on the tick mark. And that's because in a histogram I draw bars, and these tick marks are going to tell me how tall the bars are, and I want the numbers to be right on the tick marks. The only time we put numbers in the gap, again, is down at the bottom if we're using a scale of 1. And now I can show you why. So as we make our bars, what we want to do is we want to take a look at how often each data value occurs. So as I look across my data set, the first number I'm looking for is how often the number 1 occurs. And I see it once, twice, 3 times. So that means that right above this number 1, I'm going to draw a bar that comes all the way up here to this tick mark 3. And it should cover this whole gap between the 2 tick marks that is labeled 1. And what I always do, just to kind of help me out if I need to use my histogram later, is I label the height of the bar either right above the bar or right inside the bar, just so that I can see that bar has a height of 3. Because sometimes we need to add up a couple different bars, and it's easier for us than having to trace over every single time to see how tall my bar is. So then on to the next. How many times do you see 2 occur? I see it 6 times, so that means my bar has to come up here to the 6. Notice that my bar is pressed flush against the other bar. And I'm going to put a little 6 up top to tell me that that's how tall that bar is. And I move along. So for the 3s, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I put the little 5 up top so that I know that's how high it comes. For the 4s, I only see 1 4 with Rachel. So a short little bar here. No 5s to be found anywhere. And then 1 6, it's Rick in the table. And that's it. That's my histogram. Are you ready for another example? Okay, in example 2, we're going to get a little bit trickier. We're going to look at those same 16 students, but this time we're going to look at their test scores. And if you look at their test scores, the numbers are obviously a lot bigger than the number of people in their family, which we would hope it would be. And so we're going to have to make some different decisions here about the scales on our axes. But first I'm going to label them. The x-axis is going to be test scores. The y-axis, always and forever, is frequency. And of course I need a title. And let's say that these are math test scores, so we'll just say students' math scores or students' math tests. Okay, and we're ready to go. Now, remember that when we pick our scale for our x-axis, we have to look at our data set. As I look at this data set, there is no way that I want to make my bars count by 1 anymore, because then I have to go all the way from, let's see, Rachel's 63 all the way up to Brian's 100. And that just sounds like way too many bars for me to draw. So instead of counting by 1, I'm going to count by something else. What do you think a good scale would be? 5 or 10 would both be great choices for a scale. I'm going to count by 5. Now this is where things start to get a little bit different than they were in example 1. When you're counting by a scale bigger than 1, you label back on the tick marks instead of in the gaps. And that's because each bar is going to stand for the range of numbers that falls between the 2 tick marks. So right here, I'm going to put my first value. And actually, before I do that, let's figure out what we want that to be. Now, if I'm counting by 5s and my first data value is 63, I like to give myself a little bit of wiggle room. So what's a nice number right before 63 that would be nice to count by 5s with? 60 is a good choice. And then as I draw my tick marks, I'm going to count by 5, and that way my numbers will be nice and even. So we have 65, 70, 75, and so on. And I'm actually going to extend my axis just a little bit because that same rule about wiggle room applies on the other side. My biggest number is 100, but I want to just be able to see a little bit to the right there. I want to see 105. And I know you might not be able to get 105 on a test score unless there's extra credit, but we'll put that there and I will talk about why when we get there. So then looking at my frequency, remember the only thing I really have to decide in the frequency is how often our mode occurs or our most popular number occurs. And there isn't really like a standout mode to me, but I see a lot of 80s. So I'm going to give myself a good 5 or 6 tick marks on this frequency axis, and if I have room for more, I'll go ahead and put more. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll go 5, 6. And hopefully that will be enough for us. Again, my suggestion to you is to leave a little room at the top to be able to extend that axis up if you don't have enough room, but hopefully for here we will. So now, this is where it gets a little bit different. When you're looking at your x-axis, instead of just having one number smack between the 2 tick marks that represents that bar, you have a range of numbers. And what we do is we just count up all the numbers that fall between each tick mark. So from 60 all the way up to 65. But the one point I want to make is that you never count the actual number that's on the right-hand side of the bar. That's always going to go with the next bar. So we'll do 60 all the way up to, but not quite hitting 65. So in our case, with whole number test scores, we'll do 60 to 64, and then 65 will go with the next bar. So we just want to count up all the test scores that fall between 60 and 64. And thank goodness there's only one. So I'm going to draw my bar, and I'm going to put a little 1 there. And notice it's one big bar that blocks off that whole interval. We're not trying to show exactly what the number is. It's just something between 60 and 65. Then between 65 and 70, but not counting 70, let's take a look. And there are no numbers that fall in there. Between 70 and 75, but not quite touching 75, let's see. There's a 75, but again, that's going to go with the next bar, so nothing. Then 75 up to 80, but not including 80, so 75 to 79. We have 1, 2, 3, and that's it. So between 75 and 80, this bar is going to be 3 tall. And I'm going to put a little 3 there so that I can tell it's 3. Then 80 to 84, because we don't count the 85. Let's take a look. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. So that bar is going to be 4 tall. Notice again that my bar presses right against the bar next to it. Put a little 4 in it. 85 to 89. I see 1, 2, notice that 90 doesn't get counted in there, 3, 4, 5. So this bar comes up to 5. This is where I start to really to label my bars because again, it's easier to just look here than to trace over and to decide where that is. 90 to 94. We have 1, 2, and that's it, just 2. $95 to, what would it count up to? 99. Do you see any in there? There are none. And then maybe you see now why I gave myself a little wiggle room on the right-hand side. Our final bar would be at 100, which would fall in this 100 to 105 group. I hope this gave you some insight on how to make histograms. Thanks for joining me.